Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this session, which is just one session in today's Integrated Marketing Virtual Conference for Nonprofits, brought to you by the Integrated Marketing Advisory Board. Before we get started, we just want to take a moment to thank our conference sponsor, Give Together, for helping us bring this conference to you at no charge. And we also want to thank our media sponsor, the Nonprofit Times, for helping us get the word out at this unique conference. And we also want to thank our session sponsor today, HJC. And during the session, please submit your questions through the question module on GoToWebinar, and we'll pass it along to the session speakers. And so with that, I'll turn it to Heather and Mark.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining the conference. You have joined the session Translating Corporate Success for the Nonprofit Sector, Creating a Balanced Scorecard for Integrated Fundraising. Here's your speakers. My name's Heather McLean. I'm a strategic consultant with HJC, and I have with me Mr. Mark Lukowski, who's the CEO of Christian Children's Fund Canada. So hello.
Hello.
I'm going to be taking you through the first set of slides, and then we'll be wrapping up with Mark, who is going to take you through the second half of the slides and show you a really great case study. Just like the moderator said, if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them into the chat window. We're going to be pausing in two areas of the presentation for questions, and look forward to answering those from you. So today we're going to take you through what a balanced scorecard is and why you might endeavor to develop a balanced scorecard for integrated marketing. Going through a balanced scorecard exercise can take days, if not weeks, and so today we're just going to show you the basic building blocks of how you might start to think about a balanced scorecard exercise for your nonprofit organization or for your business unit. And then comes the good stuff. Mark's going to walk us through about how he's actually put this into action at Christian Children's Fund Canada. And you can see what the outcome of that is and continues to be for that organization. So the key takeaways today are that we want you to understand why the balanced scorecard is really becoming the approach for not just the nonprofit sector, but for government and industry and even military, to be honest, in the 21st century. And how different organizations are using it to really transform the way that they think about how staff, volunteers, donors, stakeholders across the board play into improving overall performance of the nonprofit. And we're going to talk a little bit about performance measures and why they're an important part of a balanced scorecard approach. And then, like I said, Mark's going to walk us through a real-world nonprofit example in action. So what's the problem? This information was taken from a survey that was done a couple of years ago in the United States. And it really, at a high level, the problem is that the staff are not connecting their strategy to their day-to-day activities. They don't understand how strategy is related to their particular job role. Not spending a lot of time on strategic thinking overall, more on tactical implementation. And they're not really looking at strategy when it comes to building budgets. So the balanced scorecard seeks to solve these problems with its unique approach. So now we're going to talk about why you might, at your organization, want to think about having a balanced scorecard. So this scenario probably sounds pretty familiar to you. The Chief Development Officer at a large international organization, he takes the executive leadership team or the senior management team away for a retreat. They organize around a table and start to endeavor to have an annual strategic planning process. They might go through the vision statement, or more likely they look at the vision statement and say, that's good enough, or, we really don't need one of those, do we? Then maybe a mission statement is prepared, or probably more often you look at the mission statement and say, yeah, the one we have is good enough, or let's not think about this right now, let's just drill down to the strategies. Then you look at core values, and I would say across nonprofits, most of us have very similar core values, but again, it's just looked at as something to tick off the list in the strategic planning process. And then fifth, you look at your programs and services and the way that you deliver your mission, and you just drop those into one of the buckets of the strategic objectives that you have. And at the end, you may have a few programs and services that are unbucketed, and so you just create more strategic objectives to fit those in. And voila, everything fits together, and really what you end up with is just a document that sits on a shelf and just justifies the way the organization is already working. And so the balanced scorecards are very different in their approach. And so some of the outcomes of a real strategic planning process using a balanced scorecard is that it can create stronger staff alignment and start to really drive change and improvement within the organization. And it's scalable up and down throughout the organization. So today, we might talk about balanced scorecards from an organizational perspective, but then those should be cascading down into each of the business units, whether that's marketing, fundraising, mission delivery, programs, so on and so forth. And having a balanced scorecard with everything neatly on one piece of paper about how your organization is moving forward really does improve transparency and accountability. And that's why donors and funders really tend to love balanced scorecards. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, balanced scorecards are used now in the 21st century by more than 50% of all Fortune 500 companies. And now nonprofits are starting to pay attention, especially as leaders like Mark, who will be speaking to you later, are moving over from the for-profit sector into the nonprofit sector and applying their learnings from there. And like I said, even the U.S. and the Army of the United Kingdom are starting to look at balanced scorecards and how they can improve performance and morale across those large organizations. So what is a balanced scorecard? I know until a couple of years ago, I had no idea. I'd never even heard of a balanced scorecard. And I reckon that many of you probably haven't either. So a balanced scorecard is really just a strategic planning and management framework. And it's used across the board, like I said, from business and industry to government and nonprofits. And it's really seeking to align the activities of the organization to the mission and vision of the organization, with the outcome hopefully being better external and internal communications and better focus on performance and targets. The balanced scorecard was introduced in the 90s by two men, Robert Kaplan and David Norton, and it's becoming, like I said, one of the most popular business management tools. There was a survey that was done just this past year of business leaders around the world who ranked the balanced scorecard as the 5th most widely used management tool. So now we're going to look at what the different elements of the balanced scorecard are, and you can see those on your screen now. The balanced scorecard was created to address deficiencies in performance management systems that really just look at financial measures. I mean, most nonprofits, we look at how we're performing on a financial basis all the time, whether that's revenue, gross revenue, net revenue. For direct marketers, we're looking at things like number of donors and retention rates and so on and so forth. But we're not really connecting all of the pieces together. And again, when you're looking solely at financial consequences of actions taken, they're really lagging indicators, meaning that they're telling you how things worked in the past, but they're not connecting the dots to show you how changes in different activities could change financial measures in the future. And that's what's something that sets the balanced scorecard apart. It focuses on both financial and non-financial metrics. So the balanced scorecard approach is really looking at what you do from 4 different perspectives, from the financial perspective to the customer perspective or the donor perspective or the stakeholder perspective, to the internal business processes of your organization, and then on learning and growth. The financial perspective measures the current performance over all of the marketing functions for marketing and fundraising, while the other three perspectives really measure the drivers of kind of future performance as it relates to marketing and fundraising. So balanced scorecards for nonprofits. You know, a lot of nonprofits really operate on kind of vague feel-good aspirations. We all do wonderful work and have amazing causes, but sometimes we lack this strategic focus or really documenting what our objectives are in a manner that everyone can understand, especially in larger organizations or even very small organizations where you're spending all of your time doing the business of your organization and have less time for this kind of strategic thinking. So for balanced scorecards, it's really about translating these high-level objectives into practical operational objectives that are communicated across the organization from leadership all the way down to donor services and the people that are volunteers that are delivering the mission on the ground. So like I said, you can see that sitting around a table over days or weeks with people across all levels of the organization, building a balanced scorecard could take a good amount of time. Today we're just going to walk through these 4 different perspectives and talk about what might be some of the performance metrics or what are some of the areas of those perspectives that you might focus on at your organization. So first we start with the financial perspective, and this is the one that is probably most familiar to everyone that's on the line. From the financial perspective includes the measurement of, you know, at an organizational level, you know, your operating income, your return on capital, the economic value that you add. And for nonprofit organizations, just for for-profit companies, you really have to have a solid understanding of your financial situation. For balanced scorecard focus on marketing and fundraising or integrated marketing and fundraising, some of the metrics that you might include are gross revenue, ROI, so on and so forth. That's generally what we report on as marketers and fundraisers, but we usually kind of stop there. So you can see here on this first slide that when you're looking at these different perspectives, you want to focus on your objectives, what would be a meaningful measure of that objective, and then you want to really look at very precise targets for those measures. And after you look at the targets, then you think about what are the initiatives, or what are the strategies, or what are the programs or projects that we're going to endeavor in order to meet that target. And then you must identify the person that will be the enabler or the driver of that particular objective. It doesn't necessarily mean that this person's doing all the work, but this person is responsible for getting the right people around the table in order to drive these different initiatives. So you can see here we're very specific with our target. We want to increase revenue by 20% over 2 years, and then we think about how we might do that. From the stakeholder perspective, or in our case, if we're fundraisers or marketers, perhaps the donor perspective, this perspective will contain a set of objectives and measures relating to donor acquisition or to donor retention, growth and satisfaction, and it will oftentimes also include objectives and measures that focus on the most important aspects of your value proposition. So some of the measures that you might find here are the number of new donors acquired or average gifts or retention rates. As if you're a direct marketer, this is an easy territory to live in. For others, it may be more difficult. But here you can see what an example of some of the different objectives would be from a donor's perspective. And then we go down to the internal processes. You know, this perspective involves, you know, really looking at the key operational processes of an organization. When you're at the organization level, looking at things like programs provided and services offered and so on and so forth. And this perspective will really give us a good understanding and help us determine which programs and services, or for marketers, channels, are meeting the real needs of our community or helping us to find more donors. So when you look at us from an organizational level, Balanced Scorecard can be useful because oftentimes nonprofits just assume a long-standing service. For example, you operated in a particular area of the country, or you have a service that you've been offering, or continuing education for adults, or something that's just been on the docket for years and years and years. And so you have this long-standing service, and then you've never really gone back to assess, is this really meeting the needs of the community? So that's where this perspective, when you're going through a balanced scorecard process, can have a big impact. So on this one, I'm looking at data processes, and this is an often overlooked area when it comes to development, but important. So if we look at, for example, the time between gift and fulfillment, or, for example, a tax receipt is sent out, you want to be in that sweet spot of getting it out within 7 business days, the gold standard. And so perhaps your target is to decrease the gift receipt fulfillment time. Well, there's a lot of different initiatives that you might have to undertake in order to meet that goal. Perhaps you need to look at barcode scanning for your direct mail fulfillment. Perhaps you need to hire new staff. Perhaps you need new IT systems. And this is where it gets interesting, because you can see that the person responsible for driving this particular initiative isn't in the marketing or fundraising department, but lies outside of it. So now you can start to see how different business units within the organization are dependent or interdependent on one another in order to meet the overall objectives of the organization. And then learning. This is the fourth and final perspective of the balanced scorecard. And this one's really interesting because this starts to try to put a measurement to the intangible assets that your nonprofit must possess in order to really perform its work with a high level of competence. And so this perspective is looking at different types of assets, like your human capabilities, so your donors and volunteers, perhaps your technological capabilities, your IT systems, your online marketing systems, your donor databases, and really interestingly, your organizational culture and how that has a direct impact on your mission and vision. So here you can see that you can start to look at culture and say, what is meaningful for our organization to say that we have a culture of philanthropy, a culture that embraces our mission. So you can see here there's how many of your employees might also be donors if you are a special events organization, how many of your staff volunteer to participate, overall collaboration without the organization. And you can see here, here's a very specific target to increase the percentage of staff participating in employee giving programs by 10% in year 1. And then how initiatives, and again, how someone outside of marketing and development might be responsible for driving this particular initiative. Now, don't let this slide overwhelm you. It's not meant to, but this is where balanced scorecards get really neat. So this is called strategy mapping, and after you take all of your objectives, this is where you get to lay them all out on a piece of paper, or in this case on the computer, and see how the different initiatives or the different strategies that you've lined up for these different perspectives, how they are related to or not related to one another. How are they causal or corollary or interdependent? And this is an important part of the balanced scorecard approach. And this is also where you start to realize that you really do need cross-functional teams in order to achieve your overall mission effectiveness, how different teams might need to work together in order to achieve each of your strategies. Implementing a balanced scorecard approach is a journey, not a destination. So unlike where you have your strategic plan that you undertake and you all approve and it goes on a shelf, the balanced scorecard is something that is a living, breathing document. You're always checking your performance measures and targets, collecting data, and seeing if you are on the right track. So for a balanced scorecard to be really effective, there has to be endorsement or leadership from the highest levels of the organization to adopt this approach. And it really becomes part of the everyday working of your organization as you start to link individual performance measures up to the vision of the organization, and start to have methods and methodologies for collecting data in a meaningful way that can help inform the future strategies. So now we're going to take a very quick look at a balanced scorecard approach from Southwest Airlines. Obviously, Southwest Airlines wants to be profitable, but this was the first time that they had adopted a balanced scorecard approach to figuring out what was the best way for them to be able to do that. And it's a really clear-cut example of how a balanced scorecard approach can help you make connections within your organization. So you can see here that Southwest Airlines went through the same process that I just showed you, looking at the 4 different perspectives of financial, in their case customer, capacities, which is another way to express internal processes, and then learning and growth. So of course Southwest Airlines wants to be a profitable company, and they realized that lower costs and increased revenue were the drivers of profitability, as they are with most companies. And they went through a process of interviewing their customers and surveying their customers to find out that the 2 most important aspects of choosing Southwest Airlines were on-time flights and the lowest prices. And the way that they could achieve the internal processes or capacities with which they could achieve across the board lower costs, on-time flights, and the lowest prices was fast ground turnaround time. The time it takes for a connection or for one plane to get on the ground, get reserviced, and then put back into the air. And so they realized that the ground crew were instrumental in ultimately the profitability of the organization, and this kind of was groundbreaking thinking for them. And so they started to concentrate their efforts around making sure that the crew were aligned with their company goals. And so they looked at different opportunities like stock options and so on and so forth, and to improve ground crew retention and morale, and how that would, in effect, have an impact on the ground turnaround time, which would then cascade up into the profitability of the organization. So this was really revolutionary thinking for them, and it's a nice, clean-cut, kind of simple way that you can look at balanced scorecards and think how you might apply it to your own organization. So I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions about balanced scorecards before we pass it over to Mark, who is going to get away from the theory, which can be a bit dry, but is important to go through if you haven't heard of a balanced scorecard before, and into how he's actually working on this for Christian Children's Fund Canada. Are there any questions? Wow, good. I'm glad. I hope that means that everybody understood what I was talking about. So now I'm going to pass the floor over to Mark. He's going to share with you about his experience.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to ask, because I'm in a different part of the world, I'm going to ask Heather to move the slides along because I don't have control. So, Heather, yes. So I'm delighted to be here in my role as CEO of Christian Children's Fund of Canada. We're an international development agency based in Toronto, Canada. We are funded primarily by sponsorships, though we do have other forms of fundraising that we've implemented in the last 4 or 5 years, and I'll talk a little bit about them inside the Balanced Scorecard. And with our funding, our focus is on helping children in poverty, children of all faiths, in 6 countries around the world. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm not your typical nonprofit individual in the sense that I have spent over 25 years as a business executive in the for-profit sector and have been CEO of this organization for the last 5 years. So I bring a slightly different perspective to the nonprofit sector with respect to Balanced Scorecard, because that is something I used in many different places in my career prior to coming to Christian Children's Fund of Canada. I thought before I get into the formal implementation of Balanced Scorecard, I share with you something that I found to be of interest to many folks that talk to me, especially because they know that I have moved from the profit sector to the nonprofit sector. And I got ask Heather to move me on to the next slide. And what I'm focusing here is some of the differences that are actually between the two sectors. Not that one is better than the other, but I think it helps us to be able to maybe interpret some of the business concepts, some of the business approaches, how they are in fact applicable in our sector, in the nonprofit sector. So if we look at the general strategic goal, I think we all agree that that in our sector, the mission trumps everything. Unlike the for-profit sector, where they'll be looking at being competitive, not only in terms of market share, not only in terms of revenue, not only in terms of, but also in terms of return on investments. It's a public company, dividend payouts, stock growth, and profitability. So everything, and when we look at the Balanced Scorecard, you'll see in a moment, everything always does and has to tie back to the mission, because that's the reason that an NGO exists. When we look at general financial goals, we're not looking at increasing profits, but our objective every day that we work at this is, are we being effective with the spending of donor dollars that we get? Are we being good stewards of the fundraising dollars that we get from the donors who trust us that we will spend it wisely, efficiently, and effectively to help achieve the mission that we said that we're on? And are we being good stewards of doing that? When I look at values, I think by what I've learned in this sector is that integrity and trust trumps everything. And the reason it does is because people support our mission, and they support us from an emotional bias and with a trust that we will fulfill what we said we would do. And so we work very hard in our organization to make sure that we are trustful and fair in all our dealings with stakeholders as well as beneficiaries. The stakeholders, they all have different I guess, lenses on the work we do. They measure our effectiveness and performance in different ways, and sometimes it becomes challenging of how we can help them understand in their view of the world what's important to them, that we're actually achieving the mission that we set out to do. And so we're challenged from the stakeholders' point of view to try to create effective metrics which also impact our social Balanced Scorecard in terms of the social impact that we're having. So it's trying to metricize, if I can use that word, the social impact that we're achieving based on the support that we get from the donors. And obviously the key success is most important is that we achieve our mission. And every day, are we doing everything to maximize social impact? Do we have specific metrics that help demonstrate that we have achieved that? I can also share with you that if you can clearly define your success factors in terms of a balanced scorecard, not only does this help you motivate your staff, not only does it help the staff to better understand what they're doing, not only does it help the staff get clarity on things they should do and things they shouldn't do, but it also is a way to express to the world, to everyone that you're trying to engage and get support of who you are. And its balanced scorecard is a way to help them understand that you are really doing what you're saying, that you are really trying to achieve the social impact that you say in your mission statement. And most importantly, it's proof points. As we deal with donors today, one of the things that we are finding increasingly in our dialogue with them is they're saying, well, we understand your mission, we understand what you want to do, but please give us some proof points that you are doing what you say. And so we have found that a balanced scorecard approach helps us do that. If I can now move on to the next slide, what I want to talk about here is that it's important that the balanced scorecard connect you back to the mission. And it helps also to define the trade-offs, because as you're working through your strategic plan, as some of the elements of strategic plan that Heather talked about, you're always continuing to try to make trade-offs. And a good balanced scorecard helps you define that, because it helps to say, you know what, this trade-off is better for us because it helps us achieve the balanced scorecard metrics that we have set out to do. If we go to slide 30, Heather, talks about that I find that the balanced scorecard helps us focus on results and not activities. Activities are sometimes easier to measure. They're really a function of what you do. A balanced scorecard helps you to focus on the right activities to achieve the right metrics inside your balanced scorecard. Activities by themselves become very dangerous because they really, in the end, may be lots of activity, but not in a quantitative or a measurable way help to able to achieve the balanced scorecard and the mission that you're committed to achieving. If I go to slide 31, what we want to talk about here is that it helps to clarify staff expectations, a balanced scorecard, because it's a way of stating to the staff, of this is our mission, and this is what we're doing, and this is how we measure ongoing progress. We also have found that a balanced scorecard approach is a great way to get new staff on board, because it helps to define for them what are the things that they're doing that we want them to do to help us achieve the metrics and scorecards that they're focused on inside their work. So that's another, and it's also a way to help us create some innovative spirit, innovative approach, because the innovation is inside the context of the balanced scorecard metrics that we've defined and tried to improve. If you go to next slide, I wanted to share with you that our balanced scorecard is really a result of a 6-year strategic plan. So we started this plan back in 2013, and what it really helps is reflects the 6-year strategy, the 8 strategies within the 6-year plan that we've set out to do. And we are now have gateposts inside the balanced scorecard approach that help us measure our progress against the 6-year plan. And this 6-year plan document is something that's used from the board of directors all the way to our frontline employees. And I think it's also important to note that the 7 strategies after the first strategy, the first strategies around social impact, all exist to help us achieve our mission, which is measured through balanced scorecard metrics inside strategy number 1. Another way of saying we're all about social impact, but we've got 7 supporting strategies to help us achieve and maximize our social impact. as defined by the strategy and the metrics of the Balanced Scorecard inside Strategy 1. We go now to the next slide. And here I've given you an example of our strategies. There's 8 of them, as I mentioned earlier. And just want to focus for a little bit on Strategy 1 and Strategy 2. So as I described to you earlier, Strategy 1 talks about how do we maximize social impact. And so there are some key metrics that we've defined that we work with our staff in the field as well as in our Canadian office to make sure that we have key measurable metrics inside the Balanced Scorecard to measure our social impact and help clearly delineate, enunciate, explain our social impact that we're trying to achieve. And the second strategy really talks about how do we grow our resources, our revenue. How do we diversify revenue sources? As I mentioned, we're principally funded by sponsorship, but we have some very aggressive metrics inside our Balanced Scorecard that help define some new ways that we can diversify our revenue and look for new ways to fund our programs and our projects. Because if we can fund our programs and our projects in new ways, we can achieve our social impact in a bigger way and further the mission that we've also committed to. I'd like to go to the next slide. And as you can see, all our fundraising metrics are all inside our Balanced Scorecard. And I'll give you an example of how the fundraising metrics are inside the Balanced Scorecard. So there's a continuum from the mission to the Balanced Scorecard to the Balanced Scorecard for the fundraising part of the organization. So we go to the next slide. Here's an example of our key, what I call our key corporate results. And as you can notice on the right side of the column, they're all tied back to a strategy. And so on a corporate-wide basis, we have identified some key areas on our Balanced Scorecard that we need to address on a continual basis over the next 6 years. And we said these are the metrics we're going to use to help us define our success. And if we can use these metrics over time, we will then be able to achieve the mission and in the biggest way possible. And we've tied every one of the key performance, key indicators of results back to our strategy inside our Balanced Scorecard. If you go to the next slide, you now see a subset of some of the key metrics, by no means all of them, but some of the key metrics inside the Balanced Scorecard that we're using in fund development and communication. So we've defined that these are some of the key ones that we need to look at on an ongoing basis to ensure that we are able to maximize our revenue on a cost-effective basis. So if you look at the next slide, so what we really are saying is that the strategy scorecard is a must, and we have basically now have implemented inside the organization. It helps us maximize any threats that we may from the outside because we can see quickly if there's some of the metrics that we're using inside the Balanced Scorecard that are not in line with our expectations. But more importantly, it enables us to create new initiatives. We're not smart enough at the beginning of the planning session to be able to anticipate new opportunities that may arise, new initiatives. But we can incorporate them inside the 6-year timeline as long as they help us achieve some of the key areas that we've identified inside a Balanced Scorecard. And so if I go to the final comments, I try to put this process in a continuum. On the next slide, Heather. And what we're really saying is you can kind of look at it as a continuum that says I start out with my strategy. I then have an annual plan every year for 6 years. I develop a Balanced Scorecard to the key things I'm going to implement during the 6 years annually. And then I can even take it one step further. I can create a Balanced Scorecard for the fundraising. And then we've got a quarterly reporting mechanism. The quarterly reporting mechanism of Balanced Scorecard is reviewed quarterly by our board of directors and quarterly with each of our executive teams and quarterly with each of our staff. So we have a continuum running right from strategy right to our quarterly reporting to make sure that we are, in effect, through our balanced scorecard mechanism, implementing the commitments that we made in the 6-year plan that we put forth and that we're really following for the time period. That will close off my comments, and I'll turn it over back to Heather.
Thank you, Mark. So now we're just going to wrap up today. So if there's any questions, we're happy to take them, or if you're sticking around for the wrap-up session following this call, I'd be happy to answer your questions then. So we just want to make sure that we did what we told you that we were going to do. We wanted to take you through the basic concepts of the Balanced Scorecard, which I think we did. We looked at the Balanced Scorecard and made sure that you understand that we're looking at this not just from a financial perspective, but from 4 different perspectives: the financial, the stakeholder, the internal process or capabilities, and the learning and growth perspectives. And looking at the Southwest Airlines case as well as the Christian Children's Fund case, seeing how it's becoming the leading strategic management tool. And especially now that there's more nonprofit leaders like Mark who have made the transition from the for-profit sector, I think that we as people that work at charities are going to be challenged to start adopting an approach like this. So by joining this session, you may just be ahead of the curve of what's coming to the nonprofit sector in Canada and around the world. And so I hope that you can see how a balanced scorecard can really help with alignment, that you can really start to rally everyone around the objectives and start to improve the performance of the organization. As Mark showed you in his 6-year strategic plan, the cover page that sits on everyone's desk and becomes the mantra or the learning manual for the organization, both for existing and new staff. We hope that having everything related to your strategy neatly on one strategy map can help you drive alignment with your new organization. And then we hope that we talked to you a little bit about the importance of performance measures as both they relate to your mission delivery and then specifically for marketing and fundraising, and how they have more meaning because they are not looked at in isolation but rather looked at in the context of a balanced scorecard. And then I thank Mark for sharing his real-world nonprofit example, and I hope we have the opportunity, myself included, to hear him speak again on how the balanced scorecard approach is starting to change the organization as they get longer through their 6-year strategic plan. So we invite you to continue the discussion. You can visit the Integrated Marketing Advisory Board website to do that and connect with them on social media, and we hope very much that you've enjoyed this session. Mark, do you have any final comments to add?
I think you've covered them, Heather. I think I'm good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks for joining, everybody.